Hello Year 9. This is the second lesson of 2021 in biology. You will need your Year 9 Life's Like That biology booklets, and we are getting towards the end of this booklet and there will be an investigation coming up. A little bit of advanced warning for the investigation. You are going to be able to do this at home, but in order to do it at home you will need some very simple apparatus, just some paper. It can be newspaper, it can be any kind of paper from a magazine. Make sure you ask before you start cutting things up, and you will need a paper clip, some scissors, and that is it, some folding skills, okay? Because you're going to be making some model seeds and then you're going to be testing them and investigating how the time it takes for the seed to fall is dependent on the size of the wing. So a little bit more about that in your next lesson. So this lesson is going to finish up the work on reproduction in flowering plants. I split it into two sections. The last lesson that we did, we looked at the structure of the flowering plant and we made sure that we could identify the parts and their functions, and also that we could describe the difference between insect and wind-pollinated flowers. We then looked at the process of pollination and what happens in pollination. So I'm going to start off from that point. You will need to turn to page 54. Hopefully you've completed the homeworks 5A and B on 52 and 53 last lesson. So page 54, you can see this diagram and the heading making seeds, except yours is in black and white and it's in glorious Technicolor here. So if we look at these diagrams, basically this structure that we can see here, I'm going to go over it. Not sure if you can see this. Here we are. This structure here is the female part of the flowering plant. So if you remember, what did we call this whole structure? This was called the carpel. On the top we have the sticky stigma. The long neck part is the style, and the swollen base is the ovary. So these three things together make up the carpel. So I'm just going to rub that all out. It's important that you remember what that structure is called. So this is the female part. The male sex cell is this one here. And remember that the pollen has come from the male structures. And the male structures were the things that look like lollipops. Together they are called the stamens. And they are made up of, on the top, the lollipop part is called the anther, and the stalky part, the stick, is the filament. So the pollen is made inside these anthers, and if your parents have ever had flowers in the house or you've got flowers in the garden and you've seen some like yellow dusty stuff on the inside of the flower on these kind of like lollipop structures, that is the pollen that you're looking at. It can be quite darkly coloured, and from some plants it can actually stain your clothes if you get it on them. So lily pollen, for example, is notorious for staining. So in pollination, that we talked about last lesson, we want the pollen to get from these male sex organs, these male structures, to the female sex organ, to the female carpel. And in order for the pollen to get from the anthers, which are growing up around our carpel here, they can either drop, if the anthers are above, they can drop the pollen directly onto the stigma, but it's more likely that an insect will visit the flower, get brushed with pollen, as you saw in the BBC Bite-Size video, and then go and visit another flower, and some of the pollen will just land on the sticky stigma. That is what happens in insect-pollinated flowers. In wind-pollinated flowers, if we go back to our homework, here are our anthers hanging outside of our flower here, our wind-pollinated flower, and the wind will blow against the anthers, and because the pollen is light, it will blow off, and hopefully some of that pollen will land on the feathery stigma of other wind-pollinated flowers, okay? So we've got insect pollination or wind pollination. Whatever the method of pollination is, the next bit is really important, because this is how we're going to get what we call fertilization. So remember, fertilization in animals, in humans, is sperm joining with an egg. So in this case, we haven't got a sperm. The pollen is the equivalent of the sperm. It's the male sex cell. And the egg is the ovule, is in here, inside the ovary, the female sex cell. So we've got to get that pollen grain to join with that ovule. That will be fertilization. So what happens is the pollen grain starts to grow a tube. And the tube grows down from the stigma, down through the style. And then when it gets to the swollen ovary, it needs to go all the way around to find the entrance into where the ovule is. So here's my pollen tube growing in a big curl all the way down. And the whole pollen grain is too big to travel down that tube, and it doesn't need to. So what it does is it sends the nucleus down the tube. And as the nucleus travels down the tube, when it gets to the nucleus inside the ovule, at that moment when it joins, that is fertilization. So we've got our pollination, that's number one, that's the first step. The pollen nucleus traveling down this tube that's been made, the second step. And the third step, the pollen nucleus joining with the egg cell nucleus. And as we said, that is called fertilization. So you have got a few lines underneath your diagram there, and I want you to describe clearly exactly what's happening in the correct sequence. So there should be at least 3 sentences, so don't forget your capital letters and your full stops. Make sure you include the terms pollination and fertilization correctly, and I would suggest that you also use the word pollen, stigma, nucleus, tube, and joining, okay, with the egg. So can you pause the video at this point and see if you can write me 3 clear sentences to describe step by step exactly what was happening in the diagram above. So at this point, I'm going to set the homework for this week. I know it's kind of in the middle of the lesson, but it's appropriate because it comes at this particular point. So over the page on page 55, you have got another sheet. So I made these homeworks a series of homeworks, 5A, B and C. So this is the end of the 5C one. And it tells us once the pollen grain lands on the stigma, the pollen must reach the ova or egg cells in order for fertilization to take place. A pollen tube grows in order for fertilization to occur. So a little bit of art here, a little bit of artwork. I just want you to draw the pollen grain on the stigma, draw the pollen tube from the stigma down to just one of the ovules. This ovary has multiple ovules. It's actually got, I think, 10 in there. Yeah, 5 on each side. And then it says fertilization takes place when the nuclei, the pollen grain and ovum fuse. So we can already see that in picture 3. I want you to fill in the missing words about the key terms and also then what happens next. So we're going to go on to the what happens next in a minute. I'm going to skip the answers very quickly and come back to those. So once we've had fertilization, what happens next? Well, if we go back to that previous diagram, once this egg cell, this ovule has been fertilized, that is going to become, okay, the seed. So the fertilized ovule will develop into the seed. And where do we find seeds? Well, if this was an apple blossom on a tree, an apple blossom tree, this would be the carpel of the apple blossom. We would have our stamens with the pollen. We would have pretty whitey pink flowers on apple blossom. And they're quite scented to attract the insects to come and pollinate the apple blossom tree. And so what would happen is the petals would fall off and the swollen ovary, this ovary would get bigger and bigger and bigger. That's the stem, okay? And at the top, there would be a little tufty bit. So because it's an apple blossom tree, probably not the neatest apple that I've ever drawn upside down, the stalk of your apple is the stem. The swollen ovary becomes the flesh of the apple, And that little tufty bit that you get on the bottom of the apple is the remnants of what's been left behind of the stigma. Okay, so we find the seeds inside our apple when we cut it in half, when we core it inside the core, that's where you would find the seeds. So a series of events that happen. The petals fall off, so do the stamens, the ovary starts to swell as it grows, and the seeds grow inside the swollen ovary. So moving forward then, we've got some fruits here that have seeds in them. So the apple we've just talked about, kiwi fruit, okay, the seeds are the little black dots on the inside, and we've got the flesh is the fruit. In peas, the pod is the fruit and the peas are the seeds themselves. In the peach, it is the stone that is the seed and the peachy flesh is the fruit. Watermelon, the little black pips are the seeds, and obviously the lovely red juicy flesh of the watermelon is the fruit. Avocado, the stone is a massive seed, with the fruit being that nice green, soft fruit inside. Tomato, we have the little yellow pips that are the seeds and the red flesh of the fruit. And in the strawberry, all of the seeds are these little dots that are on the surface. So I want you to draw label lines to show which is the fruit and which is the seed in each of these fruits. And then I want you to think about why you think plants would keep their seeds in a tasty fruit that animals, including us, would want to eat. Pause the video, draw your label lines on to show which is the fruit and which is the seed. So, why do we think that plants keep their seeds in a tasty fruit that animals will want to eat? Well, if the animal eats the fruit, they get the nutrition from the lovely tasty fruit, whatever it is they're eating. But seeds are made of mainly fibre. And fibre does not get digested in the human digestive system, but it helps to move things along. So the seeds will pass out with the animal's feces, including our feces. And because the seeds are in the feces have got lots of nutrients for those seeds and will encourage them to grow. This is why you often find in the summer, towards the end of the summer particularly, you get lots of tomato plants growing at sewage works, okay, out at the top of the sewage works, because people have been eating tomatoes. Unfortunately, the tomato seeds pass out of the humans, okay, with their number 2s, and they flush the toilet, and the sewage goes to the sewage works, and it's a perfect place, okay, for these tomato seeds to start to grow and develop into tomato plants. Okay, can you turn to page 56 for me, please? Now, after the seeds have been made, they need to be dispersed. Now, we've already talked about that animals will want to eat some of these fruits, okay, because they're tasty and they will disperse the seeds in their feces. So birds, for example, around about early autumn time when the blackberries are coming on the hedgerows, you find that the bird's poo is kind of like a purpley colour, and in there you will often see the little pips from the blackberries, okay, as they've eaten the fruit with the soft flesh in it, but the seeds pass out in their feces. But there are some other ways that seeds can be scattered, and you might remember this from when you did Pollen Park. Wind will blow some seeds, so we've got an example here. This is our dandelion clock, okay? It's got very, very light seeds with little wings on them, and this is what our seed fall investigation is going to be based on, this one and the sycamore. So sycamore also spread by the wind. Animals. Now, sometimes with animals, not only do they eat them, like the strawberry would get eaten, the gooseberry, the apple, and the pea pod, and obviously the acorn for squirrels. But sometimes animals will actually hide their seeds ready for winter for hibernation. So squirrels are notorious for burying the acorns and then trying to find them later on, okay, when they need a good food source. And if they bury them, then there's an opportunity for that seed to start to germinate and to grow. But also, animals can transport seeds on their fur. So this here is called burdock, okay? And burdock has got lots and lots of hooks on it. And the hooks will attached to the animal's fur, a bit like Velcro, okay? And so the animal may transport this seed for a while, and then it might fall off of the animal somewhere else. So dispersal is all about getting the seeds as far away from the original parent plant. And that is really important because we don't want a plant growing right next to its parent, because it will be competing for space, light, and water and nutrients. So we want it to disperse, in other words, to spread out from the original parent plant. Some of these seeds get flicked out of pods. So if we were to leave peas in their pods on the plant over the early autumn, what happens is they start to dry out, and eventually, okay, the pod splits, it bursts, and it flicks them out. The same with this. This is actually the pod from a poppy. So this is the carpel from the poppy, this is the stigma on the top, and the seeds of the poppy are tiny, tiny little black seeds. So you often see them on the top of breads and pastries. And they would be inside. There would be hundreds of these tiny little black seeds. And you get little holes appearing just underneath the top of where the stigma were. And it's almost like a little pepper pot. As the wind blows the head of the poppy, it will sprinkle and scatter the tiny little seeds out of it. Some dry out so much that they explode, okay, and release the seeds. And some seeds, like coconuts, okay, will travel by water because they float, okay. So they're just some examples. Now you've got a little task to do on page 56. You've got some pictures of these different seeds, okay. I will go over these seeds because they're quite small, the pictures, but I want you to see if you can add them to the correct table. Can you describe how you think the seed might be dispersed or spread so it can't compete for space, light and water? So we've got witch hazel, we've got cherry, these things are called beggar ticks, violet, bean, a cattail, dandelion, coconut, blackberry, jewelweed, wheat, sandbur, maple. This is called a lotus root, I'm pretty certain, and this one is milkweed. So see if you can add those to the table. Pause the video now and have a go at adding them in. So our coconut is definitely the water one. Our cherry is going to be animals because they're lovely and tasty, along with our blackberry. The bean could be either animals or explode or flicked out, because as the pod dries out, it will flick out the seeds. Wheat would be our animals particularly like mice and dormice, okay, would spread this. Sandbur gets caught on animals' fur, so this is animals. Maple is the wind. This is like the little helicopters, like the sycamore that we see. Milkweed is also the wind because it's got this lovely large surface area. Jewelweed is flicked out or exploded. So's the violet. Dandelion is the wind. The cattail is explode. These are, I suppose, a bit like rushes that you find at the edge of streams. Be very wary. Some people try and pick these. You shouldn't pick any wildflowers, but if you pick them and you think they might be quite nice to have at home, you leave them in the house and they have a tendency to just explode as they dry out, and then you have hundreds of seeds everywhere all around the house, okay? I know from experience, okay? Beggar ticks, they will stick to animals' fur. And witch hazel, that one will explode too, okay? So make sure you've written those ones down and turn over the page. So the last part of this lesson is an extended writing task. On the top of page 57, you've got a picture of the life cycle of a flowering plant, starting from the flower and going all the way back to growing a new flower again. I want you to write in the correct sequence some recount text to explain the life cycle of a flowering plant. And you're going to start at the flower with pollination. So I want you to try and use as many keywords as possible. So to help you, I've got a couple of pictures on the PowerPoint here. And if we're starting with pollination, see if you can figure out which would be the diagram that's showing pollination. So take a moment, look at the pictures, which ones would show pollination. So pollination is our number 1 in terms of sequencing, and it's this picture here where our little bee is visiting our dandelion, and you can actually see he's dusted, he's completely covered there with pollen, and he will buzz off then to another flower carrying his pollen load with him, and the pollen will then stick to where? So what do you think is the next step? The next step is going to be fertilization. So the pollen will stick to the stigma, start to grow its pollen tube down until it joins with the ovule, and at that moment that is fertilization. After fertilization then, remember that this becomes the seed, and the seed is formed inside a swollen fruit. So number 3, fruit formation. Which picture shows fruit formation? It's this one here. This is actually a very unripe blackberry. And these little structures that you can see here are the anthers, and we can see that the petals of some of the other fruits are starting to fall off as well. So you've got the little stigma on the top, okay, of each of these little circular fruits. So the blackberry is not actually made up of one fruit, it's actually multiple little tiny fruits, each of them very juicy and bursting with liquid. Once we've got our fruit formation, okay, we want the fruits either to be eaten, but we definitely want the seed that is inside the fruit to be dispersed. Seed dispersal, as we've said, it can either be animals eating this blackberry, okay, it can be exploding, it can be water carrying the seeds, but seed dispersal in this particular diagram is the wind, and these are our little seeds just there with their little wing, their parachute to help carry them. So that will disperse the seeds. So that will leave us finally with number 5, germination of the seed. And these are, you should recognize them if you've ever grown them before, these are sunflower seeds. You can see the seed case still left on the top of the leaves there. So they have started to germinate. In order to germinate, they need warmth, they need moisture, and they need oxygen. They do not need sunlight. That is a common myth, okay? You can start to germinate seeds in the dark, but as soon as they get their leaves here, they will need light because they need to start to carry out photosynthesis. So, here's your diagram of the life cycle of the flowering plant. Pause the video and I want you to spend some time writing recount text to describe and explain. So I'd be wanting to see pollination. I'd want a description of that. I'd be wanting to see then fertilization. Okay, I'd want a description of how the pollen gets there. I'd be wanting to see seed formation, fruit formation, seed dispersal, and germination. So use this diagram along with a combination of what's on the previous page to help you. Okay, so you can always rewind the video to help you write your recount text. Make sure at the end that you proofread your recount text for capital letters and full stops. And if you run out of space on page 57, because I haven't given you an awful lot of space, you can always use, another sheet of paper and put it inside the booklet to complete. Thank you, Year 9.